Hi, welcome to Titan Tips, a short video segment where we here at Titan Reloading try to help make your future reloading sessions just a little bit easier. My name is Michael, and today we're going to be talking about the priming system on the Lee Loadmaster. We're going to discuss the operation, the setup, and a few of your troubleshooting options in case it is acting up on you. But before I get too much into Loadmaster, I do want to mention that even though out of the box, straight from the factory, they do appear to be put together and ready to run, they are not. And you will most definitely want to do all the setup for the press in order to get it running smoothly. Without much further ado, let's start talking about the priming system. Half of the primer feed operation, and what's going to happen is you are indexing the shell plate. The casing is going to hit this lever arm, and what that's going to do is push it to the back to allow a primer to feed in. And as you bring the ram up again, the primer wedge bar is going to push down on that lever arm and force the primer under the casing and over the primer pin, seating the primer. Now the primer pin is moved on the other side of the press, so let me get a good view for that. Okay, so on the other side, this rocker arm is the piece that is actually pushing the primer pin up. This bolt is going to be what is causing it to move. So as you can see, it's going to make contact, force that down, and then that's going to be what is seating your primer. Before I get into the setup and adjustments you can make to the primer feed system, I do want to mention that it is absolutely vital that you set up your dies first, especially the first die or your full length sizing die. The reason for it is the full length sizing die, you screw it down until it touches the shell plate, and then you advance it about a quarter turn further. And what that means is the distance that the shell plate can travel is determined by that die. Even though it may not make a whole lot of sense right now as to why it's important to do it in this order, I will say that setting the primer seating depth isn't going to make a whole lot of sense if the distance the ram can travel hasn't even been determined yet. So it is absolutely important that you get your die set first before moving on to the primer feed system. When I do show the setup for the primer feed system, I will have the turret removed. That way it isn't taking up a lot of space on the video and help you get a better, clearer view of what's going on. But I do want to mention that it is absolutely vital that this sizing die is set first before you even start messing with the primer feed system. When it comes to setting up the operation of the primer feed system, there is really only one adjustment that you can make. And it is going to be this bolt right here. As I mentioned in the operation, what happens is it pushes up on that lever rocker arm. So the further down this is, the further up the pin pushes. And of course, vice versa. If this is backed out, then it will not push that primer pin up as much. So what you're really looking to do is adjust the seating depth and timing of that priming operation. It is important when you set up the primer feed system on here that you have a case with a spent primer in it, and that's going to help you to adjust the depth that you're looking to seat this at. So what you'll do is bring the Loadmaster with the spent casing to the second stage here. When setting this up, you'll probably want to have this piece backed out. That way when you bring this up, you can screw this further down in order to get more contact with the rocker arm. You'll want to lower it until it pretty much stops itself. After you've done that, you'll want to drop the ram back to the bottom and lower this further down again, almost a half turn, but not quite. And it is at that point that you'll want to lock this bolt right here to keep everything in position. When it comes to a smooth operation of the primer feed system, there are a few other things that can come into play. One of them is going to be the primers that you have in the trough and in the hopper. Since the priming feed system is gravity fed, if you are getting low on primers, then there is a good chance that it will not feed primers just because it doesn't have that weight bearing down on it. Another consideration is that it's not getting enough shake. And what I mean by that is when you raise the ram, there's these two bumps on the frame itself that cause the hopper to shake or jiggle. And what's going to happen is if you're not getting enough wiggle on the hopper, it may not be giving it enough of a budge to slide down the trough. What I've seen some guys do is put zip ties on this part of the frame right here, which will give it more agitation. Another possible issue comes into play when you are reloading multiple cartridges on the same Loadmaster. And what happens is between the turrets and their die sets, their sizing dies are set at different depths, which is going to cause the timing of the priming system to be inconsistent. What I mean by that is when you're setting up the sizing die on your Loadmaster, you're going to screw in the die until it touches the shell plate and then advance it a quarter to a half turn further to ensure that it has solid contact with that shell plate. But what can happen is between the different setups on your turrets, the sizing die depth is different between them. And what that's going to cause is the shell plate carrier can either go up further than it's supposed to, or it's not going to be able to go far enough up in order to seat the primer appropriately. And that's going to cause issues with timing. Another possible issue that you could run into, that I have run into myself, is in the shell plate carrier. What can happen is in higher humidity conditions, or if the lube of the press is getting into areas that you really don't want it to, it can cause there to be a buildup of residue or dust. And what has happened to me is there was a buildup below the primer feed trough, down here where the pin and the spring sit, and it wasn't allowing the primer pin to drop all the way back down. If the primer pin is not allowed to drop all the way back down, then it's not going to be able to feed primers because it's hitting the primer pin instead of pushing on top of the primer pin. That's a pretty easy fix, is you could just take a paper towel, wipe it down. If you have Q-tips, you may be able to use those to get in there. But if you're not feeding primers, it definitely is worth looking into what is going on in the shell plate carrier to make sure that there aren't any obstructions stopping the pin from dropping down as far as it's supposed to. And that can be one of the issues that you're facing. If you are running into issues where primers seem to be sticking in the trough, and you have attempted to add the zip tie on the back here to give it some extra agitation, and it's still not working to get those flowing smoothly, even with a full primer trough, there are a few things that you could do to help get it running a little more smoothly. The first thing I would suggest is using canned air or something like that, Q-tips, anything to try to clear out any buildup or residue that might be inside of there. If that doesn't work, you can attempt to use dry lubes like graphite to possibly help slide the primers through, but I would be careful about using too much. I would definitely stay away from using any wet lubes, as if that sits in there too long before drying, residue, dust could cling to it, clump up, and now you're just making the issue worse. In order to get the primer system running as smoothly as possible, there is an optional setup that you can do on the Loadmaster. Now, because shell plates are made to cover a wide range of cartridges, they are not designed specifically for the brass that you are using. So when it is priming, at the top of the stroke here, you'll notice this case does have some wiggle to it. And there being wiggle in the case could cause the priming to be a little less consistent than you want it to be. If you are reloading pistol cartridges, what Lee suggests that you do is use a universal decapping die in the first spot here, and you move the sizing die to the second spot, removing the decapping pin. And what happens is it sizes the case as it's priming it, and since it's sizing it, it is holding it center and snug, so it does not have any wiggle to it. Now, of course, rifle cartridges is a little more complicated to do that with, because the sizing die, the pin inside of it is actually what sizes the mouth of the case, so you can't just remove that pin. Lee has started making their quick trim dies a few years ago, and that quick trim die does have O-rings at the base, and the neck portion is sized very similar to the neck diameter of your brass. So it'll have the same effect of holding that case in place with the quick trim die. And of course, you don't have to worry about it doing anything to the primer, because the quick trim die doesn't do anything with the primer. So that has been the priming system on the Lee Loadmaster. Again, we covered the operation, setup, and some of the troubleshooting things that you can do to help your press get it running smoothly. If you found this video to be helpful, be sure to like it and subscribe to our page. If there's anything else you would like us to cover, you can leave that in the comment section below. And if you have any tips yourself to help getting the primer system running smoothly, again, should definitely leave that in the comment section, as it can help other reloaders. I'm Michael, and as always, happy reloading.